All right, let's just jump right in. Today, we're going to travel back in time, all the way to the 15th century, to look at a really fascinating and powerful critique of Christian theology. It was written by one of the great Jewish scholars of the age, Rabbi Shimon ben Tzemach Duran, but we'll know him as the Rashbatz. This explainer is going to break down his arguments, and honestly, it's a masterclass in theological debate.
Wow, that quote, it just cuts right to the chase, doesn't it? The Rashbatz is going right after the core Christian claim of his time, the idea that the Torah, the law of Moses, was basically replaced by the gospel. His entire work is a direct response to this, and he's not just poking holes, he's planning to take it apart, piece by a methodical piece.
So you might be asking, who is this guy? Well, the Rashbatz wasn't just some random voice shouting from the sidelines. No way. Born in Spain in 1361, he was a brilliant doctor and a top-tier Talmudic scholar. So this work wasn't just a passion project. It was a carefully constructed refutation from a man whose entire life was about logic, medicine, and deep, deep scriptural study. And because of that, his words had some serious weight.
Okay, so here's what's so compelling about his approach. He doesn't just, throw random objections at the wall to see what sticks. The Rashbatz builds his case like a lawyer in a courtroom, resting his entire argument on 4 big, distinct pillars, each one designed to challenge Christian theology from a totally different angle.
And this is basically our roadmap for the rest of this explainer. First, he's going to look at Jesus' own words and actions to argue he never wanted to get rid of the Torah. Second, he pulls out the logic card to challenge doctrines like the Trinity. Third, he dives into the prophecies that Christians said Jesus fulfilled. And finally, he gets into what he calls straight-up errors and contradictions inside the Gospels themselves.
All right, let's dig into that first pillar because, honestly, it's a brilliant strategic move. Instead of attacking Christian scripture, he flips the script and uses their own text to build his case. His opening argument? Jesus was a good, law-abiding Jew from start to finish.
And where does he get his proof? You're not going to believe it. He pulls this quote straight out of the Gospel of Matthew. It's like he's saying, hey, let's not argue. Let's just look at what you say Jesus said. It's a killer move, using Jesus' own words to challenge the whole idea that he was there to scrap the Torah. And he doesn't just stop with one quote. Oh no, he keeps going. He points to that time Jesus told a leper he healed, go do the sacrifice Moses commanded, or when he told his disciples to listen to the Pharisees. And get this, even after Jesus was gone, his closest followers were still observing Jewish law. For the Rashbatz, this is exhibit A, B, and C. Their actions speak louder than words, right?
Okay, so you might be thinking, but wait, what about all those parts where the rules do get relaxed? The Rashbatz has an answer for that too. He says, look, that was basically a marketing strategy. It was a special deal for the Gentiles, the non-Jews, to make it easier for them to join the movement. It was never, he argues, a new rule for Jews to ditch their own traditions. All right, pillar number 2. Here's where the Rashbatz totally switches gears. He's done playing inside the Christian scriptures. Now he's taking Christian theology and putting it on trial in the court of pure, cold logic. He's focusing on ideas he says are just fundamentally irrational. And his main target? The Trinity. The idea of one God, but existing as 3 distinct persons? For a scholar like the Rashbatz, who comes from a tradition where God is one, and only one, absolutely indivisible, this just didn't compute. It was a huge logical hurdle for him. And this slide really lays out the fundamental clash. On one hand, you have the Jewish idea of God, a single, unified being. No body, totally non-physical. But on the other hand, you've got the Christian view, at least as Rashbatz understood it, of God actually becoming a human. A God in a physical body who could feel pain, get scared, and even die.
So this leads to his big central question. It's a real head-scratcher. How can someone be 100% God, but also be tempted by Satan, or feel fear, or have to pray to someone else for help? To the Rashbatz, it just doesn't add up. It's a flat-out contradiction.
And once again, where does he find his proof? Back to the Gospels. He points out how often Jesus calls himself the Son of Man. He highlights all the times he prays to God as if he's talking to someone else. And that moment on the cross, that cry of, my God, why have you forsaken me? For Rashbatz, that's the ultimate proof. That's not God talking. That's a human being in pure agony. And that brings us to the real showdown. This is where his third and fourth arguments kind of melt together. We're talking about the war of verses. The battleground is the Hebrew Bible, the scriptures that both faiths share. And Rashbatz's claim is simple. Christian theology isn't built on fulfilling prophecy, it's built on misreading it.
So here's his core argument in a nutshell. He's saying that the whole Christian claim hinges on yanking verses completely out of their original Hebrew context. He's convinced that if you just read them the way they were intended to be read, in their original context, they have nothing to do with Jesus.
Let's look at a classic example, Isaiah 7:14. So the Christian interpretation hinges on the Hebrew word alma, meaning virgin. But Rashbatz steps in and says, hold on, that word just means young woman. But even more important, he says, is the context. This whole prophecy was a sign for a guy named King Ahaz, meant for him in his lifetime. It wasn't some crystal ball prediction for 500 years down the road. And he does the exact same thing with Micah 5:2. So you know the story, it's read as a prophecy about Jesus being born in Bethlehem. But Rashbatz says, nope, the prophet is talking about King David's family line, which came from Bethlehem. Then he throws in this little logical punch. The prophecy says a ruler will come from there. Well, Jesus never ruled Israel. In fact, quite the opposite. Okay, one last one, from Hosea. Out of Egypt I called my son. This gets applied to Jesus as a kid returning from Egypt. But the Rashbatz is like, read the chapter. The verse is clearly, explicitly talking about the entire nation of Israel, often called God's son, being freed from slavery during the Exodus. You see the pattern here? For him, context is king, and he's arguing it's just being thrown out the window. So after laying out these four massive pillars, intent, logic, prophecy, and scripture, the Rashbatz rests his case. And what he created wasn't just some forgotten essay. It became a cornerstone, a really foundational text in the long, complicated history of Jewish-Christian debate. So, what's his grand conclusion? It all boils down to this. In his view, Jesus was a devout Jew. Maybe he even thought he was the Messiah, but he never ever claimed to be God. That whole idea, the Rashbatz argues, was a later invention, born from his followers' misunderstandings and, well, that strategic push to make the religion more appealing to a non-Jewish audience. So if we're going to sum it all up, what are the big takeaways? First, this wasn't just a rant. It was a systematic, four-part argument. Second, he had this brilliant tactic of using Christian scripture against itself. Third, he was all about logic, pitting reason against what he considered illogical dogma. And finally, his whole case rested on reading the Hebrew Bible in its original context. And that leaves us with one final big question to think about. I mean, this is a 600-year-old text, but the conflict it describes feels pretty current, right? It really makes you wonder, what can this ancient argument teach us today about the profound challenges we face when different communities can look at the exact same words and see completely different worlds?